Hello and welcome to How to Survive Your International Dream Job, a webinar brought to you by AIA Contract Documents. This webinar will give you an overview of the new B161 2002 International Agreement. This presentation is protected by U.S. and international copyright laws. And all of the education provided by AIA Contract Documents is provided for general informational purposes only. The information is not provided as legal advice. We always recommend that you confer with your legal counsel. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, Jonathan Orlove, to introduce himself and get us started with the presentation.
Thank you, Hasti. My name is Jonathan Orlove. I am an associate principal at SCB in Chicago, Illinois. So SCB primarily works on domestic projects, but previously I worked at Adrian Smith Gordon Gill Architecture, also in Chicago, and worked on projects in a pretty large number of different countries. And just to list a few, in Canada, China, India, Israel, Korea, United Arab Emirates, a pretty good group of places. I led the task group that was charged with revising the B161 document, which we will be talking with you about. I had a great group of people working with me over the past 2 years, and one of them was Donovan. I was very fortunate to have Donovan on the team, who really had great insights into international practice.
Yeah, so good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Donovan Orlove, which sounds astonishingly similar to Jonathan Orlove over the webinar. I am Senior Vice President and General Counsel with HOK. Like Adrian Gill, HOK practices in locations all over the world, and I've been involved in negotiating contracts in countries all over the world, from Canada to the UK to the Middle East, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and in other more remote locations. And so, yeah, we hope to bring a good knowledge base of experience and give you a very good overview in what is a very interesting, rewarding, and challenging practice, and that's the international practice.
Okay, these are the learning objectives that we're going to cover over the next hour. So understanding how to provide services overseas and how they differ from working in the United States. We're going to go over steps that you may need to take to successfully work on a project overseas. We're going to talk about common challenges. And then we're going to talk about the B161 document, which was revised this year and published earlier this month. So it is now available on the ACD software. Next slide. Before getting into the subject matter of the B161, we're going to provide just a little bit of background about the AIA Contract Documents program, which is widely recognized as the industry standard. The documents are created and updated by the AIA Documents Committee, which both Donovan and I are a part of. And it's composed of architects serving a 10-year term, and we work with AIA attorneys and staff and legal and insurance experts. The process is iterative and includes a wide range of participants, including industry leaders, AIA membership, and subject matter experts. Next slide. The AIA issued its first agreement, the Uniform Owner Contractor Agreement in 1888. That was the image on the previous slide. In 1911, the AIA issued the first version of the General Conditions document. And in 2017, the 16th edition was issued of that document, now known as the A201. At this point, the AIA publishes nearly 200 different agreements and forms. Next slide. Okay, so we are going to have a poll. We'd like to get a little bit more understanding of who the audience is. So we're going to poll you about your experience in international work or lack thereof. And then also, if we have time remaining in the webinar, we'd like to know what of these topics you'd like to learn more about. So Hasi, you'll let me know how that is going. Any feedback on the poll?
So it looks like thus far, the majority of our attendees have limited experience. So 44% have limited experience, 36% have extensive experience, and about 20% no experience but interested.
Okay. All right, that's great. And I think that's a very good mix. And I like the fact that the majority is limited experience, because I believe that this document will serve that group very well. So next slide, please.
And John, let's go ahead and we can launch the second question, which is what topics most interest you? So if our attendees don't mind taking a second to vote on that. All right, so it looks like the winner here is client agreement. So about 44% would like to learn about that. Second up is scope of services. So a little over 30% would like to learn about that. And there's a tie between license and local architect.
Okay, great. Thank you. We are going to touch on all of those topics in the webinar, but again, if there is time remaining, we can entertain questions on any of those particular subjects in more detail. So this of the full suite of documents offered by the AIA contract documents, to my knowledge, this is the only document or agreement that that addresses projects outside of the U.S. So the obvious question is why? Why prepare that agreement? And particularly because there are international forms that are available. Up at the top or on the screen are a couple of those. The reason is we thought, since this document is being prepared mainly for US-based architects, we wanted to organize it and format it in a way that's familiar to US architects and US architects that are familiar with the AIA contract document. So it's organized in a way that is very consistent with that and will hopefully soften the learning curve. in terms of practicing outside of the US. The other thing is it's really a resource in a way for how projects can be organized. I'd argue that generally clients are looking to hire US-based architects for their design expertise, but I think they're also interested in expertise on how to organize and deliver projects. And the contract is one way of demonstrating that. Next slide, please. When the task group was working on the document, we struggled quite a bit with terminology, and we received a lot, an inordinate amount of comments from our liaisons with terminology suggestions. So even when using the English language, there can be big discrepancies in how words are understood. Case in point, the word program is spelled differently in British and American English, and the words mean two completely different things. So with several exceptions that we'll go through in the webinar, we decided to use terminology that is consistent with the balance of the AIA documents. We felt that that would be more familiar to the US architects who are going to be the predominant users of the agreement. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background about the B161 document. It was first published in 2002. The title is rather long. It's the standard form of agreement between client and consultant for use where a project is located outside of the United States. These highlighted words here in red are sort of the exceptions in terms of terminology. Client is used instead of the word owner, and typically that's how clients are referred to in international projects. Consultant is used in place of architect, and that's intentional because it is assumed, it's a premise with this agreement, that the US-based architect will not be licensed in the location that the country where the project is located. So one would not be able to consider themselves an architect who is practicing. The previous slide, thank you. The documents are normally updated on a 10-year cycle. In 2012, this document was passed over. It was considered being retired, but thankfully it was decided to put resources to the document to revise it. And so now that has been published this year, as well as a guide document, which is known as V561 and is available to free of charge. Next slide. This is a simple relationship diagram showing how the document's used. It's fairly straightforward. The key takeaway here is that the client hires the consultant through the B161, and then the client will hire a local architect separately under a separate contract. Next slide. So who is the intended user for this document? We felt that we had to tune the document to a particular user. Otherwise, it would be too difficult to develop a one-size-fits-all agreement. So it's not to say that the document is exclusively for use by the intended user, but it is, again, it's scripted more towards that group. And it's for those that want to, start to work on international projects that may not have very much experience. Also, as we mentioned, it's likely going to be used by an architect that is not licensed in the foreign jurisdiction, which is why they would be known as a consultant. it's intended that the majority of the work would be produced in the United States, not offshore in that country, and that a limited amount of work would be done after the design development phase. Now, even if the consultant is working within this format, it's still strongly advised to get proper legal and tax suggestions, especially for those that have not worked internationally before. Next slide. And I think, Donovan, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, great. So we've created a hypothetical project that's based on a fairy tale many of you are probably familiar with, The Princess Bride. And while the project may seem like a fairy tale, it is it has a lot of components that are indicative of what we see in international requests for proposals and requirements from international clients. But as out of this realm of reality as it may seem, if we go to the next slide, there are quite a few examples of projects that really push the boundaries of what we think are possible and are quite extraordinary in themselves. Whether it's a 400,000 square foot tower, 27 stories tall, that serves for a single residence for a family in India, or artificial archipelago, sorry, in the that creates a development, the Palm Islands, or it's a museum on the sea. There are endless examples of extraordinary projects that create extraordinary design opportunities and really create great opportunities for working abroad. So the next slide, we'll go into what this is, an opportunity of a lifetime. So next slide. So again, a little background on this RFP. If you recall from the fairy tale of The Princess Bride, Princess Buttercup in our fairy tale project did not marry Wesley. She instead ended up marrying the evil Prince Humperdinck, and now it is the king and queen of the kingdom of Florin. And so Wesley, who was dejected by his lost love, fled to America as a young lad to pursue a career in architecture, as all people seeking a better life do. But before we get into the details of the proposal, just a quick few thoughts on international proposals. And while these might be applicable to domestic proposals, I think they're even more applicable when you're looking at an international proposal. Quite often, the RFP is a document that is incorporated into your contract verbatim, and these can be extensive documents. Well, they can be quite limited or extensive, anywhere from 4 pages to, I've seen, well over 2,500 pages. It's important to understand that international clients are writing a request for proposal in a project within their country and within their understanding of how services are delivered. And so what is implied in the contract, and we'll point out some examples, or what's implied in the proposal, is as important as what is expressly stated. And one of the things that I talk about with our professionals over and over again is that when we're writing proposals on international contracts, we need to be very, very clear about what it is that we're offering to do, and specifically include those aspects of the proposal that we are not offering to provide services on. Because what happens is that if by incorporation of that proposal, then the architect is deemed to have accepted those services as written, and that can get you into a bind very, very quickly. So next slide. So to go through real quick what our proposal is, Her Royal Highness Queen Buttercup of the Kingdom of Florin is seeking qualifications and proposals from highly qualified international consultants for the development of a privately owned property near Humperdinck City in the kingdom's capital. The property, which is known as Buttercup Estates, is strategically located on the island of Fezzik, and within 30-minute boat ride of Humperdinck City's commercial center, Humperdinck International Airport, and the Cliffs of Insanity, which have become a major attraction for rock climbing enthusiasts following the signing of the peace treaty with Gilder and the lifting of international sanctions. A few things to call out here in this very brief description, which are important to be mindful of, and that is this is a public call for a private development. And as you move internationally, the lines between public and private can get blurred very, very quickly. And in fact, what you find in some locations is that you're actually doing business with what are called pseudo-governmental entities. So they might be private, or they might appear in all respects as private companies, but they are owned largely by the government or staffed by government officials or other people with ties to the government. So that's an important point that we'll come back to in the future, but it's something that exists in our RFP. Also, while there was a reference to international sanctions in an RFP, you're never going to get anything as big as a red flag such as that. But we'll talk a lot more about sanctions, but you know, knowing that there were sanctions on the Kingdom of Florin, it's important to understand that's a red flag in and of itself and should proceed with a high degree of caution. I also like to point out in an RFP, you'll see quite expressive language, and it's important to understand that if this document gets incorporated into your contract, what does that mean? What is a first-class experience? What is the highest quality of Florinian architecture, design, and prestige? Are these standards that you can achieve? Do they elevate the standard of care? It's, you know, these words have impact, even though they might just be expressive of the aspirational aspect of the project. Also, we noted that it's a 500,000 square meter mixed development. So, actually, you know what? I don't think I got to that part. So yeah, so in the project overview, we'll go on and read the rest of it. The project is intended to be the crowning achievement of Queen Buttercup's reign, is to exhibit the highest quality of Florinian architecture, design, and prestige, comprised of 500,000 square meters of new development, culture, and art. Two 5-star hotels with a luxury day spa, 3 restaurants, private residence, so on and so forth. Must exhibit the Queen's values of sustainability and respect for Florinian culture. The initial budget is 100 billion Florinian crowns, and to be completed by the Queen's 80th birthday on May 1st, 2025. So again, a lot of standards and implied, or standards that could be incorporated as elevated standards into our contract. We also know that we will be working in the metric system, which much of the world outside of the US operates. What is 100 billion Florinian crowns? Well, we'll need to investigate that. It sounds like a lot of money, but you know, depending on the exchange rate, it could be a variable amount that changes quite quickly. And then the date of the proposal is June 8, 2022. So given the ambitious program that is set out here, is it really able, or would we really be able to deliver it within 3 years? So next slide. So looking at the scope of services, the successful consultant will enter into a contract with Buttercup Estate Foundation LLC to provide all architectural engineering services required to design and construct the project. The consultant will prepare all tender documents, provide all construction supervision for the entire works. The consultant will be responsible for compliance with all building codes, laws, and regulations as amended by the Kingdom of Florin. The consultant will submit tender documents for permit, liaise directly with the Buttercup Estate Foundation and its stakeholders. Consultant will prepare a work plan that will include regular meetings, design workshops, and other activities in Humperdinck City as necessary to successfully complete the project. I know those with extensive experience in practicing international, they have seen these all-inclusive consultants will do everything that we ask them to do, and they'll do it all within the location where the project is, or the country where the project is located. And so it's important that there's immediately questions that we need to ask. Are we going to be required to open an office in Florin? Can I provide all these design services? Preparing permit, bid, and construction documents, what does that mean in Florin? And construction supervision, that is not a term that is one that we use in the US, but it's one that has a very specific meaning in the international context. And also extensive travel to Florin, what does that mean? How do I price it? And how do I actually accomplish that? So the selection process will require a detailed master plan, conceptual design of the major architectural elements, evidence of BREEAM certification, project delivery work plan, and the financial, and it will also require a financial proposal that covers all fees and costs for delivering services in the AIA design standard, also construction supervision, full-time on-site liaison, and obtaining all applicable license permits required by the Kingdom of Florence, as well as a performance guarantee. So we'll talk about what those mean, but in exchange for the technical proposal, the successful proposal will receive 100,000 Florinian crowns. Again, is that enough to do a concept master plan and a detailed concept design? But that payment will be in exchange for the intellectual property. So that's very important to understand, that upon submission of your design and payment of the stipend, you are conveying your intellectual property associated with that submission. One thing that is unique, you won't see this very often, and that is that the contract, the consultant is allowed to submit their form of contract, and so that will allow us to proceed with our presentation. And finally, in the RFP, there are things to be aware of. As Jonathan noted earlier, program does not mean a detailed requirements of design spaces and adjacencies. In this context, the word program means schedule. And so the schedule can tell you a lot just by looking at things such as the way dates are noted. If you'll look on our schedule, we have confirmation of interest on Sunday, 3/7/2021, 2022, questions on Thursday, 21/07/2022. Immediately, it's clear that the date format is the day first followed by the month. And so you cannot look at scheduling requirements in the context, in a US standard context, or you might find yourself missing some key dates. Also, work weeks do not always start and end in other parts of the world. You might have work weeks start on Sunday and end on Thursday in some countries. And so it's important to understand that the work week may be different depending on where you're pursuing work. US holidays have no meaning abroad. HOK did a long project in Doha for the Doha airport. It took over 10 years to complete. And it always seemed like when there were issues on that project, they happened in the time period between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I can't tell you how many times we were told there's no Doha, there's no Christmas in Doha. And so that's important to understand that you're working in a foreign jurisdiction with their own holidays and their own ways of measuring work and dates. So next slide. So our Wesley farmhand has come to the US. He's now a partner at Dread Pirates and Roberts, DPR. He has not worked outside the United States despite being from Florin, but he hopes to become a black mask architect rather than a black cape architect and seek fame and fortune by doing this project in Florin. He also wants to get back to his home country and perhaps rekindle a lost love. So we'll come back to the concept of why do we want to do this international project, and we'll always be challenging whether or not our goals and objectives are worth the risk that we'll be undertaking. So next slide, Wesley does what every good partner does and flips the proposal over to his marketing manager, Miracle Maxine, who then raises her hand in astonishment, not knowing where to start. So let's help Miracle Maxine find a way through this. Next slide. So we always want to start with due diligence. This is probably the most important piece of work that you can do on any RFP, but especially on international RFPs. And it really gets down to who am I working for, and is this project something that I want to invest my time and effort in? Next slide. Whether or not it's a real project, there's a lot of resources you can go to try to figure that out. You can research and find out if this is an existing client. Is Buttercup Estate Foundation around? Have they done other work? Do we know anyone that's done work with Buttercup Estate Foundation? And what was their experience? We've already looked at the program and budget and determined that at a 10-to-1 exchange rate and a 2-year or 3-year delivery time frame, that's not realistic. And so is that something that we want to get involved in? I also think it's real important to talk to your insurers. Insurers have their own experience with clients, but they also have networks that they can reach out to. And if an insurer is aware of a client, it's probably not for really great reasons. And so it's really important to talk to insurers and find out what kind of what do they know, and if they have people they can put us in contact with to find out more about it. And again, what is my reason for going into this project? Is it to grow? Is it to rekindle lost love? Is it to seek fame and fortune? Are those goals and objectives consistent with the potential risks? But getting more specific, it's really important to know who your client is. And we've all opened bank accounts or done business with clients for the first time where we've been asked to fill out a Know Your Customer form. And those forms are very important. Those forms are aimed at getting at really kind of three key bits of information. That's one, who are the beneficial owners of the client's organization? Two, where is this client located? We know where the project is, but do we really know where the client is located? And who will be the ultimate end users of the services and the ultimate beneficiaries of the services? Know your business or know your customer questionnaires. A really good one should have questions about the name of the company, Buttercup State Foundation, its date of incorporation, any tax ID numbers associated with it, its legal status. Is this a private company, a limited liability company, a governmental body? All addresses that you can obtain that are related to that company, try to obtain them, whether it's through the company's website or through the RFP. Who are the representatives? Who are your contacts within that organization? What are their names and contact information? And then what's key is really, and this is a delicate, very delicate issue with our clients, and that is asking who the beneficial ownership interests are. You really want to drill down to find out who ultimately owns the company that you're doing business with. Is this a, and that is the LLC owned by another LLC? And if so, who owns that LLC? And so it's, a series of questions till you get down to where you finally get to individuals who ultimately own and control the company. And so this is important as we go to the next slide for really determining if this project is legal. And there's two kind of questions to answering. That there are two aspects of answering: is this a legal project, or can I legally perform this project? One is from a U.S. perspective. So it's important to know if you're permitted under U.S. law to contract with this client, to do business with this client, to export technology to this client. And it's also important from a in-country perspective to know if you're awarded a contract, can you legally perform it? Do you have to have a license to do the scope of work that is being asked? And what does it mean to obtain a license? Do I need to have a work permit? Is a visa required to travel to the country? So we're familiar with traveling to Mexico and Canada, perhaps the UK or European Union. When you land, you go through the immigration, and your passport is stamped, and that stamp serves as your visa, and you're allowed into the country for a limited amount of time. It's important to know, traveling internationally, that that's not how it works with all countries. If you go to India or if you go to China, you have to have a specific visa that is incorporated into your passport that you present on the day you arrive in country. And that visa requires that you go to a consulate in the US to obtain it, and it takes time. And so if you arrive in India or China without that visa, you'll be denied entry, and you'll have to get on the plane and fly back home. So it's important to understand what it takes to travel. It's important to understand if Florinian crowns are convertible and exportable. If they're not exportable, you'll be required to set up a bank account, and the money that you make will be paid to that account, and you may not be able to get that money out very easily. And so it's important to really understand that. And also, it's important to know if payments for your services are subject to taxes. As a rule of thumb, anytime money crosses an international border, there is a tax of some sort. There is a withholding that gets retained from that payment and paid to the local tax authorities. And so that can vary from 5% to 45%, depending on the jurisdiction. So it's important to understand that and to know that, because that can make your project go from profitable to non-profitable very quickly. But just touching on U.S. sanctions, I'm not going to go into this in a great detail, but it is something that is in the news now, and it's something that's really important when looking at international work. And there are plenty of seminars. I'm not an expert in U.S. sanctions, but have come in contact with it enough to know that it is a topic that's important to take very, very seriously. Sanction programs are targeted usually against countries, but also target individuals. And it's usually when countries or individuals are behaving in a manner that's inconsistent with foreign policy objective or a national security interest of the U.S. And sanctions involve the blocking of assets or trade with particular individuals or countries. And sanctions are administered by the U.S. Department of the Treasury Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC. And OFAC has a lot of resources. They have a specially designated nationals list, which identifies all of the people that OFAC is monitoring that have sanctions against them, that are U.S. companies and individuals are restricted from doing business with. They have a list of active sanction programs by country, so you can understand which countries are subject to sanctions. And so you can use OFAC as a resource to run names affiliated with Buttercup Estates or with other people that are associated with the project to see if they are an SDN or if the Kingdom of Florin is subject to an active sanctions program. There's one more thing to consider, and this is rare, but it's not unheard of. And HOK, we had an experience right when COVID was starting. We were being asked to design some laboratory spaces in the UAE. And so we looked into this and discovered that there are actual export restrictions on designing those spaces for foreign countries. So drawings and specifications are technology, and in the International Trade Administration has export regulations on the exportation of technology that is potentially associated with production of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, or other weapons of mass destruction. There's a commerce control list, and it has items such as, biocontainment facilities, level 3 or level 4. So you can do a level 1 or level 2, but if you're in a level 3 or level 4, that becomes non-exportable technology. Their export regulations are a little bit different than sanctions, in that the exportation is allowed, but it's allowed under an export license, and so you have to apply to the ITA and obtain a proper license. And so that it's important to know that it's rare, but it's important to know that there are those types of restrictions.
Hey, Donovan, I just want to make sure we have time to go through the B161 document, so we may want to speed ahead a couple of slides.
Oh yeah. So well, we can we can skip over. Why don't we jump down to slide 29 and just kind of wrap up this section. What do we want to do? We want to use it's very difficult to use to obtain the KYC information from clients, but you should use the question and answer process to do that. And then I identified some of these other items, finding a U.S. attorney to help on some of the red flag issues, and an in-country attorney to advise on professional licensing, along with tax consultant.
Okay, evaluating the opportunities. So I'm going to go through these rather quickly since we're running out of time here. But at this stage, one would really need to take stock of the opportunity and see if this is something worthwhile to work within the format that was requested within the RFP. So a lot of these prompts talk about, and everybody will have access to this slide deck after, so you can look at this, but it's really taking stock of if this is a format that you're able to work in, and if not, as Donovan talked about, there's the opportunity to make recommendations. Next slide. Again, this is all about what is the scope of services that is being requested of you, and the manner in which the project is set up, and things to consider whether you are capable of addressing the project as it's being asked of you. Next slide. Donovan had talked about some of these things. For example, budget and schedule. Budget in particular is something that is very difficult to assess, especially when it's provided in a foreign currency. You need to have creative ways to really assess if the opportunity is real, and if it's being organized properly. Next slide. The concept, and we'll talk about this when we go over the B-161 document, additional services in many foreign jurisdictions is a foreign terminology. Usually services are considered all-inclusive. Everything is involved. And so that's something you have to really look at carefully in the RFP and in the form of agreement that is being proposed by the client. Next slide. We are accustomed in the US for the clients to fulfill certain obligations, generally describing the site, such as providing a survey and geotechnical information. Oftentimes overseas, the client is looking at the architect to be a one-stop shop, to essentially retain all consultants and all services. And one really needs to assess, particularly if they are not licensed in that jurisdiction, if that's something that is a reasonable thing to do. Next slide. This is very important. The local architect, you will be tied to the hip of the local architect since you are not licensed in the jurisdiction, and you really need to know who they are and their qualifications and their abilities. Also, their level of involvement and a clear delineation of services. As we mentioned in the layout of the agreement, the client has one agreement with the consultant, the architect, the US-based architect, and then another agreement with the local architect. And one needs to know what the other party is doing to make sure that there aren't any scope gaps or overlaps. Next slide. I won't go into this in detail, but clearly getting paid is always a challenge, even with domestic projects. It's exponentially more difficult overseas because of various regulations, tax requirements, the manner in which clients are accustomed to paying consultants. This is something that one will really need to educate themselves on. Next slide. And then, there's the added complexity of perhaps being paid in a different currency. Of course, it's desired to be paid in US dollars. That is not always feasible. Next slide. And then travel is something that really needs to be considered. Travel overseas is expensive, and the RFP requires that the architect or the consultant is there frequently and often, and one needs to determine how that is being paid for, and how to deal with things like visas, and how to avoid creating a permanent establishment by excessive travel. Next slide. I think, Donovan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, we're going to apply. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this, and we'll drop down to the B161. But I will point out that one thing that's really important with respect to terms and conditions is that when you're practicing in civil law jurisdictions, which a lot of countries are outside of the UK, US, Australia, Canada, that much of what you're required to do is statutory. And so you'll have minimum required services, very restricted ability to change those services. You might have unique liabilities that don't exist in the U.S., where there's limitation on where limitation on indirect damages, but imposition of things like decennial liability, which is a strict liability for structural integrity on projects, and it's very unique to some civil law jurisdictions. Also, going to the next slide real quick, I always think it's important to understand what the market terms and conditions are in that country. And by market, I mean what is it that architects most often agree to there. With respect to the standard of care, it's almost uniformly identical to what we agree to in the U.S. and what's consistent with insurance, with our professional liability insurance. But it's also quite often that they obtain a limitation of liability. And since in a lot of civil law jurisdiction, indirect damages are not recoverable, a waiver of consequential damages is quite easy to get. I'll save dispute resolution for talking about the B161, but you also might find that liquidated damages are something that's statutory and quite common as well, that are not something that we would typically agree to in the U.S. So why don't we just drop down to the next section?
Okay, so the RFP allowed, and typically RFPs allow for questions, and also to even propose how one would like to work on the project. And in this case, we would recommend that Wesley uses the B161. So next slide. These are just a handful of excerpts from the revised document, the B161 that was just published, and just to point out how this could help the design professional, the consultant, and limit risk. So this touches on some of the things we talked about. And the first item here is just clarifying that the consultant is not a licensed design professional. And then the item below is that the deliverables that they are providing are insufficient for construction, meaning that the local architect is going to be providing those documents. Next slide. The document includes this checkbox format where one could identify how far they are going into the design of the project. Once you get to the 4.5, I think in the next slide we'll talk about the further design document phase services. But the premise is that the consultant is going to be working through the design development phase, and then afterward provide what is sometimes called design integrity services. Next slide. So in this section, it clearly points out that the local architect is providing what we termed further design documents. It's basically everything after DD or the phase that the consultant stops work. And the consultant's obligation is to review the local architect's documents to make sure that it is consistent with the design intent that is established. Next slide. And this covers the same concept, but in the construction phase when it comes down to submittals. Clearly, as not a licensed professional, the consultant cannot action submittals, but will provide recommendations and comments to the local architect that they will then use to action the contractor submittals. Next slide. We talked about additional services. It is more common, and this may sound like semantics, but it is more common for foreign clients to understand additional service as a change in service, meaning that the services that you originally signed up to provide have been changed in some way. So this section addresses that concept. Next slide. And I think I'm turning it over to you, Duncan.
Yeah. Okay. So I always find it's interesting in international contracts that the client obligations are almost entirely omitted, and that there really is no obligation, and even in some instances, a very limited obligation to even pay for our services. So the B161 lays out about a page and a half of client obligations that are important. They're standard, and as we mentioned earlier, this document is drafted for to be familiar for a U.S. architect. So you have your standard supplying information and ability to rely on the information, but more importantly, it is the client's obligation to retain the local architect. And then there's another page and a half of obligations with respect to the local architect. So it's very clear what the consultant is doing versus what the local architect is doing through the client. So next slide. And really, expectations of the local architect are to do everything that requires a professional license. So it's preparing documents for submission to planning authorities. It's liaising with those authorities. It's doing all of the construction phase services, whether it's supervision or whatever they're called. That's all to be provided by the local architect. Next slide. The B161 has a table for identifying travel obligations, and this is important for really kind of segregating out what work is done in country versus what work is done through the outside of the country. Claims and disputes are, you could have an entire seminar on claims and disputes, but it's important that the B161 sets up a process where disputes will be resolved first through mediation through the International Center for Dispute Resolution, identifies the place of mediation, and establishes that mediation is confidential. Mediation is not something that is understood commonly in the international context, and so it takes some explaining to clients, but it's not unheard of. But then the most important thing on the next slide, I'm sorry, we're a couple slides down. Yeah, on the next slide is that we are doing, that the disputes are resolved by arbitration. We don't want to be in local courts. We want to make sure that we're able to control who our decision maker and ultimate trier of fact is by appointing an arbitrator, and that we have an opportunity to identify where the seat of arbitration is. The seat of arbitration is important because if you have to seek court enforcement of an arbitration agreement, the laws of the location or the seat of arbitration would apply and the courts would apply in that context. So, and then as I mentioned, the governing law in this contract defaults to the place of the business of the consultant. That's not often where we end up. We all know that it's usually the laws of the jurisdiction where the project's located, but it's important to know with the B-161 that we start with where our client is performing, where our consultant is performing the services, and then the limitation of liability. There is one in the B-161, and it allows for the insertion of an aggregate amount, or if there's no amount, it's the amount of compensation received by the consultant. So I believe we've run out of time, got a couple minutes over. Apologies for that, but the other considerations that are important and written into the contract, all deliverables will be in English, and that that metric units will be used, and that a United States-based documentation standards will be adhered to, which allows hopefully the elimination of disputes about whether it's the client standards or American standards which apply.
Okay, we have run out of time, so next slide. There are a lot of resources that our task group discovered while we were updating the document, and those that have access to this slide deck will be able to access that information. There's a wealth of information out there. Previous slide. The one thing I want to point out, slide before, is the B-561 document, which is available on the AIA website free of charge. What we found is it is very difficult to provide a one-size-fits-all agreement that can allow you to work anywhere in the world. So there are very unique circumstances in each country, and this is, I'd say, a fantastic guide to provide insights in terms of many different jurisdictions. So again, we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank you all for taking part, and hopefully we have not caused any concern about working overseas. Many firms do it. It's manageable. It's exciting. I highly recommend it and wish you the best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you.